Okay, so hopefully, unless somebody tells me, you are seeing now my title slide. Is that right? Somebody tell me.
You are good to go.
Thank you. Great. Okay, so today I'm going to discuss the ways of thinking embodied by LCT. I'll begin by talking about a major problem we face when researching the social world. It's a problem that we may not always notice, but it distorts and it limits our vision. I'll then discuss how LCT offers a different mindset, a different vision. And I'll go through 4 ways of thinking embodied by LCT that overcome that major problem, and which you need to know if you want to understand and use the framework. I should say that I'll be mentioning concepts and methods from LCT, but I don't have time to define everything because that would take all week. So if anyone is completely new to LCT, you might need to watch this again after reading some papers that introduce and illustrate the framework. So I'll start with the problem. Now, as researchers, we're taught that there's a choice that we have to make. It's a choice offered in textbooks and classrooms, and it's proclaimed in research articles and conference papers. It's not a choice anyone would want to make if they hope to understand and improve the social world, because it makes a tough job nearly impossible. But it's often asked of us, and how it's asked takes many different forms. Do you value academic or everyday knowledge, theory or experience, the abstract or the concrete? Do you study structure or do you valorize agency? Are you quantitative or qualitative? Are you aiming to make generalizations and explain things, or do you want to interpret the specificities of something singular? Do you identify with the sciences or the humanities? Should education be based on instructivism or constructivism? These are just a few of the many choices that we're offered all the time. Yet really they're just one choice, because whatever the focus and whatever you choose, all these questions lead to the same place, which is a big dichotomy. What's a big dichotomy? Well, Bourdieu talks about the space of possibles. And I define the space of possibles as describing our vision of what you can legitimately choose to constellate together, what ideas, what beliefs, what practices, and so on. How you can constellate together those ideas, practices, and beliefs, and so on. And how you value or legitimate the resulting constellation you've got. Now, there are all kinds of practices and ideas and beliefs and so on that can be chosen. And there are endless ways of constellating, putting them together. So the space of possibles that we have should be expansive, and it should be full of flexible constellations of all these ideas and so on, flexible and nimble. But big dichotomies reduce their number and make them rigid. And they do so through either or, all or nothing, and for or against strategies. And what are they? Well, the either or strategy offers stances in pairs of which only one can be chosen. So for example, either you're qualitative or you're quantitative. You're not allowed, for example, to choose both, and you can't choose something else. That's the either or strategy. The all or nothing strategy means that you have to choose something as a part of a whole or not at all. And a big dichotomy takes this to the level of entire constellations. So if you adopt one stance, you are held to adopt everything else in the same constellation. So for example, qualitative might be constellated with notions of anti-positivism, or giving voice to experiences from below, or critical theories, for example, amongst many other things. And quantitative might be constellated with scientism, and maybe imposing analysis from above, and maybe dominant or conservative approaches, among many others. So in a big dichotomy, that's just a tiny one, but in a big dichotomy, if you choose qualitative, for example, you are then at the same time choosing all those other stances in that constellation and denying all the stances in the other constellation. So to choose one thing is to choose a constellation as a whole. And there are so many ways into this all or nothing kind of choice. So in this tiny little example, you could enter it by wanting to be radical or progressive, and then maybe you choose a critical theory and then think you must also be doing qualitative research and giving voice to your participants, and that means sort of all sorts of other stances flow on from that are not necessarily related to being progressive. What's more, the final strategy, the for or against strategy, means that when you choose something, it's held to mean that you are a believer or a hater. So if you choose qualitative, a big dichotomy suggests that you value its entire constellation, no matter what. It doesn't want to hear you say, I choose qualitative for this problem. Instead, that choice is interpreted as saying, I value qualitative approaches always and everywhere. And it also means that you devalue the other constellation. Like, you know, haters gotta hate, and big dichotomies won't let you shake it off. So whole constellation, these whole constellations of ideas and stances and beliefs and so on, they become reified. They appear to have an objectivity that imposes itself upon researchers as almost natural as the way things are done. Now, so far I've talked about big dichotomies. What the hell am I talking about? Well, there are plenty of examples. You can find them at the very start of Western thought and descriptions of ancient Greece. It's extremely common to portray Plato and Aristotle as representing opposing constellations of ideas, pitting idealism against materialism, the universal against the particular, and so on. And it's also very common to say that these constellations remain the template for intellectual debates ever since, where you have to choose all your stances from one or the other. And in many ways, that's true, because you can find similar dichotomies in accounts of all kinds of intellectual change. So, for example, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution of the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries, that's often portrayed as a sort of big dichotomy that pits belief against reason, revelation against observation, with science, in this case, being progressive and being seen as meritocratic. And we find this, again, it was the 17th and 18th century, we find this again in the 19th century, with the Romantic Revolution against science. So science came in against something, now something against science. And what's interesting here is that some of the stances get switched. So science had previously been portrayed as meritocratic and about empirical diversity, but now is being portrayed by critics as all about domination and similarity. So stances might change, and they might move from one constellation to another, and the constellations might change names, but the big dichotomy remains the form that this takes. And these aren't historical curiosities, by the way. The Enlightenment made the modern world possible. And the Romantic Revolution is, as Zaya Berlin put it, the greatest shift in the consciousness of the West that has occurred. And if we go through to the 20th century, and it's still going on, the biggest intellectual argument of the 20th century, the two cultures debate, same thing, a series of couplets that oppose one another. Each of those are strongly associated. So there's lots of couples, or even two or threes, and they are opposed to each other. But then they're also very strongly associated with others within that constellation. And if you choose one, you're assumed to choose them all. So if you're after knowledge or truth, then you must also be a positivist. And if you're more concerned with meaning, then you can be an anti-positivist, but you can't be both. You can't care about truth and be interested in meaning, for example. Okay, so hopefully you're getting a sense of how ubiquitous these big dichotomies are. In fact, you can find their traces not just in history, but also in almost every written paper in social scientific research. You see it in the claims made about approaches in introductions. You see them in the theoretical framework sections. You see them in the method sections and so on. The traces of these things are everywhere. For example, you know, we are studying X, therefore we are going to use this approach Y and these methods Z, almost as if it flows. But the strange thing about these big dichotomies is that they often go unnoticed. They kind of hide in plain sight. And one way they do that is that they're often described as revolutions or radical breaks, even though they reproduce the same basic form. For example, in education, where a lot of people here come from, a constellation called instruction or instructivism and variants of that name has long been portrayed as dominant. And then over the recent decades, a series of revolutions have been launched against it. So this century, for example, in the last couple of decades, we've had a so-called revolution from instruction to learning. And the slide has a few of the many attributes of those constellations, according to proponents of student-centered learning. And many of these are the same, pretty much, as previous revolutions, such as progressivism in the 1970s. And they are actually, in many ways, educational versions of the same stances we saw in the Romantic Revolution and in the two cultures debate. So what we're kind of experiencing in education is a series of revolutions that lead to a new, renamed big dichotomy. And these claims of radical breaks with the past conceal that continuity, the continuity of that form. They make these big dichotomous ways of thinking seem natural, even inevitable. Now, okay, so why does any of that matter? Well, it matters because big dichotomies and the kind of ways of thinking that they embody are false and they're limiting. First, the individual choices are often false dichotomies. For example, there's no need to choose between, and I keep using this example, but there's no need to choose between either qualitative or quantitative, or either truth or meaning, either knowledge or knowers. And second, the strong links among stances within a constitution, within a constellation are often false. There's nothing that necessarily links together qualitative, in-depth, critical, or quantitative, generalizing, conservative. I mean, it's completely wrong to claim that generalizations cannot be generated through qualitative research, or that quantitative methods cannot be critical. Choosing one stance does not mean you have to adopt an entire constellation of stances. So when big dichotomies turn one decision that we've made into a whole host of other decisions, whether you like it or not, they're falsely limiting. They're limiting what it is possible to do with theories and methods, and what we see as legitimate to bring together. And they also limit how much of the social world we can see, and that's something I'm going to come back to. Third, the notion that the two constellations are the only ones available is false. I mean, we can see that in the way that they offer a caricature of research practices that are very dissimilar to how we actually go about research. Continuing my theme of picking on methodologies, it's common to constellate, for example, quantitative analysis with being closed or imposed or neat or tidy. And anyone who's ever done it knows that it's not. It's an incredibly messy affair. It involves a lot of judgment, a lot of experience as well, not just sort of following a procedure. And the same holds for educational theories. It's not common for classroom teachers to use straight instructivism or constructivism. They tend to mix things up and make their own constellations. So the two constellations that offer, these binary constellations, offer a false dichotomy as well. But because they're everywhere and they can seem natural, and they can pressure people into thinking that this is how things should be done, and this is what's legitimate, they can have a kind of a weight to sort of pressure. And scholars and students can think that they have to choose particular combinations of practices and beliefs and ideas, like thinking that being critical is using a particular kind of theory or critical theory or qualitative, or thinking to use LCT as an example, thinking that using something like a plane or a profile or a translation device, that these are the dark arts of colonial Western Northern standpoints. And when people feel that, they're denying themselves potential resources they could draw on. Understanding and changing the social world is really bloody hard. So we need to mobilize all the theoretical and methodological resources that we can. But these big dichotomies I'm talking about, they distort our vision. They make it hard to see what we need to understand and change the world. So if we're always being pushed into making choices, and if each and every one of those choices leads us into a big dichotomy, we're also held to make a bunch of other options. I mean, what can we do? This seems like a no-win scenario. I don't believe in the no-win scenario. We do have a choice. There is a way out of this. And in fact, that's what LCT is designed to offer. The framework embodies different ways of thinking. It offers a different mindset. What is that mindset? Well, I'm glad you asked. That's what I'm going to discuss now. So I'm going to discuss ways of thinking that I believe are crucial for not only for breaking free of big dichotomies, but also for understanding LCT, because it's not enough to know the definitions of concepts. You need to know how to use them. So I'm not talking about ways of thinking because I've certainly gone all psychological. It's simply that the concepts and methods of LCT do nothing on their own. They need scholars, they need educators to put them to work, and to realize their potential, those scholars and educators need to have a sense of the ways of thinking that those concepts embody. So I shall set that out, and I call it a mindset of possibility because of how it expands possibilities along two fronts. One is that the concepts and methods can see more possibilities thanks to the ways of thinking they embody, these ways of thinking, which I'll go through, are realist, relational, and dynamic. And each of those modes of thought allows us to see more of the social world than we otherwise would. And the second front is that LCT offers a flexible framework. Any concept can go with any analytic method and any kind of data to study any kind of social practice. In other words, it aims to break the links the big dichotomies make among ideas, beliefs, and practices, and so offer more possibilities. And it does that by putting the problem at the heart, the problem being addressed at the heart of decision making. It aims to make clear that each choice depends on the problem, and it's not a decision that involves others for always and everywhere. So my main point will be that both in terms of what it enables us to see and in terms of what concepts, methods, and analyses can be brought together, LCT offers possibilities and reveals more of the space of potential, more of the space of possible social phenomena we can understand and change, and it opens up the space of possible ways of studying those phenomena. And I'm going to highlight 4 ways of thinking that I've just mentioned, and I'll go through each of these. Realist thinking, which just it sees not just empirically visible practices or beliefs, but also the organizing principles underlying them. Relational thinking that sees not only things, but also the complex network of relations among things, which give them meaning. Dynamic thinking, which doesn't just see static states, but also processes of transformation and change. And problem-oriented thinking, which not only understands the frameworks construct the objects of study, but also then constellates their stances to respond to the specific needs of each problem being addressed. Now, for each of those, I said it doesn't just do one thing, it also does another. And as that suggests, these ways of thinking are not the obvious ones in social research. More widespread is what Bourdieu called the ordinary vision of the social world, a sort of common sense understanding that pervades not only everyday life, but also a lot of scholarly work. And that ordinary vision, as he called it, gives rise to ideas that just describe features of the world, social world, as if they are easily visible empirically, as if they're just perceivable. And it describes social phenomena as if they're like things. And it focuses on unchanging states of being. And it tends not to discuss how ideas are translated into specific problem situations. And now LCT, I'm going to argue, allows us to see everything that that vision can see and more. So to help explain the ways of thinking of LCT and how that does that, I'm going to compare them to this ordinary vision. And to ground that discussion a little bit, I'm going to draw on some examples. Specifically, I'll use as a comparison knowledge typologies. I'm talking about things like hard, soft, pure, applied, abstract, concrete, knowledge that, know-how, pedagogical content knowledge, and many others. And they're a useful comparison because they're similar in some ways to LCT. LCT's often been, not just this, but often been used to explore knowledge practices in education, and knowledge typologies are similarly used to bring knowledge into the picture. But they do so in a different way, and that allows us to see how concepts possess different properties and different powers. They have different kinds of affordances. Because unless we're really clear about this, I'm not arguing they're useless, I'm not arguing they should be dismissed. They have affordances of their own. So, for example, there are differences in knowledge practices to be seen. And also they are just an example here. And this comparison is really just to show how concepts embody different ways of thinking and to start talking about their capacities and affordances. I also need to make clear before I go on, another caveat is I'm not setting up a dichotomy here. I use typologies myself, and we can use them alongside and in conjunction with LCT. We can use them together. So it's not either all or nothing. Okay, I hope that's clear. Now, talking about ways of thinking can be a bit abstract and mind-boggling, but it does get easier as we go along. So bear with me and we'll see how we go. Right, first, now, Bourdieu wrote of the whole ordinary vision of the social world, which fastens only on visible things. And I've highlighted here visible, because the first way of thinking that's quite common in research is to see the social world as if it can be easily perceived, as if it's just self-evident and everything we need is already available empirically. The kinds of concepts this gives rise to often rely on what Bourdieu called pre-constructed notions. So that is, they rely on widely used but ill-defined ideas. So the idea of what they point to seems obvious to us, and then the concept treats that idea as if it is easily and obviously visible to us. So, for example, in his very famous typology, Biglan treats terms like hard, soft, pure, and applied as if they're self-evident and clearly empirical. They're just simply not explained but fine. And if you look at the definitions of types, they often don't tell you how they are meant to be seen. They describe them, but how do you see that knowledge is vertical or horizontal, to use an example from Bernstein? Now, this means they're really useful for highlighting that there are different kinds of knowledge practices, and they have an intuitive appeal. They kind of describe something that we can just get. And they're also not based on nothing, to use a double negative. For example, I mean, despite not defining what its types really mean very well, studies suggest that Bigland's typology does actually map quite well onto subject areas in terms of their distinctively different patterns of characteristics of various kinds. So this ordinary vision, as Bourdieu called it, is onto something. And that's why ideas like knowledge, that know-how, or pedagogical content knowledge, or threshold concepts, they kind of make sense to us, they have value. But if that's all we use, then we don't see as much of the social world as we could. If we come to believe that we only need to explore things as if they're already empirically perceivable, then we miss out on what creates those ostensibly visible features. And it's a struggle then to explain what makes something pure or applied or vertical or horizontal or whatever it might be. Another way of thinking about what I'm trying to say here is to consider all the different forms that animals take. Now, empiricist thinking would typologize animals in terms of whether they're covered in fur, or scales, or feathers, whether they fly, swim, or walk, whether they lay eggs or gestate for offspring, and so on. And by looking at what is really easily visible about animals, it would come up with types such as animals with fur that gestate their young and live on land, or ones that have feathers and lay eggs and fly, and so on. And by the way, this is me just describing how empiricist thinking would do it. I'm not saying how biologists do it. Now, that's fine. Those kind of categories or types are fine. It can shed light on many issues. It may be all you need. And in fact, distinguishing animals by morphology and behavior is actually incredibly important in biological science. So it's not as if it doesn't have value, but if that way of thinking is the only way of thinking available, we're missing possibilities. We are missing how flying or fur or laying eggs is shaped by underlying features that are not easily visible, such as DNA sequence. Now, in contrast, that's what realist thinking tries to look at. It tries to look at both. It tries to look at what's readily visible and what lies beneath, and which may only be seen by looking at its effects. In LCT, we see that kind of thing with the concepts of organizing principles, such as epistemic relations and semantic gravity and positional autonomy and so on. And these don't gather together a set of empirical features as categories. Organizing principles are not defined as bundles of empirical features put together into a box. Rather, the strength of each principle is manifested in various empirical features, but it's not identical with those empirical features. I mean, for example, a few minutes before this talk, I said aloud, "This is full of tea. Tea is a beverage." And my first claim exhibits stronger semantic gravity than my second claim. The meaning of "this is full of tea" is more dependent on the context than tea is a beverage, because you needed to be physically present to know what this referred to. But stronger semantic gravity isn't defined by using the words "this is," or it's not defined by sharing a physical space. That's just how it manifested in that specific instance. So unlike empiricist thinking, LCT distinguishes very strongly between the underlying organizing principles and the empirical manifestations. It's a bit like distinguishing between the DNA and the behavior and the physical appearance. Why do we do that? Well, first, because there are many ways in which an organizing principle might appear empirically. In other cases, for example, semantic gravity, stronger semantic gravity might appear as an expression of personal experience, or it might be a particular physical movement or a particular series of musical notes and many other things. And secondly, because each empirical instance of social practice involves numerous other organizing principles. Like, for example, my claim that "this is full of tea" wasn't just dependent on the context, it was also experiential. And that's not a semantic gravity issue. It can be but that can be conceptualized as exhibiting stronger social relations, or at least stronger social relations than my less experientially based claim, "tea is a beverage." So there's more going on. There's more going on in an empirical instance of something than just one principle. So we distinguish between the empirical and the principle. And that's why it's wrong to say things like knowledge codes refer to science, or science is a knowledge code, because empirical practices like science and concepts like knowledge code are not one-to-one. They're not interchangeable. Science can have other specialization codes in other contexts. Knowledge codes are manifested in all kinds of other ways and other kinds of practices. So there's not a one-to-one relationship. So if you use this way of thinking, this depth realist thinking, if you think in terms of underlying organizing principles, you're seeing more than you can through the ordinary vision of the social world. You can see what's not readily obvious. Semantic gravity, epistemic relations, and so on. They're not readily perceivable. And that's why we have to develop ways of seeing the effects of their strengths, which is what translation devices are all about. Now, it's easy to forget that the idea of translation device is really unusual. Really is very unusual for social science. And the device shows the number of different strengths of an organizing principle relevant to a problem situation. And it shows how each of those strengths is manifested in the data being analyzed. And that allows the same concept then to be used to look at very different things. So that expands the number of possible objects of study you can use that concept to look at. And because it makes everything explicit about how it's translating into all these things, it expands the number of different possible studies whose findings we can bring together. So it makes it more possible to have more of an integrated account of things instead of all the segmented models that we usually contend. And finally, this kind of thinking also enables us to see new possible practices that may not yet even exist. So LCT is generative. If we look at the, metaphorically speaking, if we look at the DNA of practices, and if we then change that DNA, like some sort of crazy scientist, and we make new practices, we can change that DNA and then we can make new practices from it. So for example, if a set of classroom data, maybe it's only limited to instructivist forms of pedagogy. Maybe that's the only thing that you can see. Instructivist forms of pedagogy, the sort of thing that emphasizes the acquisition of knowledge and downplays the personal attributes of learners. And we conceptualize that. We can conceptualize that using specialization codes as being stronger epistemic relations, weaker social relations, or a knowledge code of ER plus SR minus. And then we can vary those strengths and generate at least 3 other codes. And then we can take any of those and translate them back into pedagogic practices. So if we take one we know, ER minus SR plus, we've changed both the strengths. That's a knower code. That would mean downplaying knowledge, emphasizing the personal experiences of learners. And then we can translate that back into practice, and we can describe how that would play out in things like maybe less curriculum content, maybe more discussion of personal experiences, less teacher talk, more student discussion, and so on. So even if instructivist pedagogy was the only form of teaching practice we ever experienced, we can generate other forms of practice, even if they've never before existed. That's true way beyond education. So realist thinking, in other words, allows us to see beyond the limits of what has already been thought, said, or done to figure out what may not yet exist. That is expanding the space of possibles dramatically. So that's the first way of thinking. I think it's really important to understand if you're going to use LCT. The second one, which I think is just as important, and I think these get easier to understand as we go along, comes back again to that Bourdieu quote: the ordinary vision of the social world which fastens only on visible things. And now I've highlighted things, because substantialist thinking is when you see the world as if it's made up of things. So this is what you're doing if you create concepts by isolating a set of empirical features common to this proclaimed category or type. And if you then treat that type as if it's a discrete thing with essential properties. So you gather up some features, you give it a name, and then you treat it like it's a separate thing. And that's actually quite common in theorizing. So for example, knowledge typologies usually gather up features such as the kind of content or the kind of context, things like that. I'm thinking here of distinctions such as theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge, or academic knowledge and everyday knowledge. And then they place them into strongly bounded types. And then those types can be treated as if they refer to distinct and separate things in the real world, like, as Norbert Elias put it, like tables and chairs or pots and pans. Now, I said before, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. It can help us think about differences, and it can highlight there are indeed different kinds of practices. And that also may be all you need in your research, but it does have limits to its capacities. But simply, in research, each type acts like a box in which you're meant to put empirical data. So if you work with real world data, you soon find out that practices don't normally fit into boxes. Often practices are not, they're not pure or applied. They're not horizontal or vertical. Going back to the DNA example, it's like having those 3 types of animals that I made up, and then going into a classroom, and everything's just like this. Everything's a duck-billed platypus. I mean, it's covered in fur, okay, but it lays eggs, and it's got a bill, and it lives largely in water. It doesn't fit my little typology I made, because the substantialist thinking behind that sees categories as if they're like things, like separate boxes. Now, LCT sees both things and relations among things. It embodies relational thinking. So rather than dividing phenomena into separate things with discrete qualities, LCT also explores the relations among phenomena which give those qualities meaning. So, for example, organizing principles, semantic gravity, social relations, these aren't collections of empirical features. We don't compare practices to them. When I said this is full of tea and tea is a beverage, they're not analyzed according to whether they do or do not have semantic gravity, whether they do or do not have social relations, and so on. All organizing principles underlie all actions and beliefs and dispositions and contexts and so on. So those questions would be pointless. The answer would always be, yes, there is context dependence of some kind, or yes, there are relations to actors of some kind. So the question is not whether they're present or not. The question is how strong they are. We're stronger and weaker relative to other possible strengths. So if we think, I think in pictures usually. So in terms of visual images, I think substantialist thinking is like having a set of boxes and treating social phenomena like different kinds of things to be put into different boxes. And LCT sees social phenomena, the way of thinking, sees it differently. So imagine an empirical instance of something. It could be a belief, practice, a text, whatever. And think of it as being intersected by a line. And that's an organizing principle. And where it is on that line is its strength for that organizing principle. And it's also on other lines. It's also on other organizing principles as well. It has positions on those lines too, and they're the strengths of those principles. And all those strengths are relative to other instances, so that other practices, other beliefs, or whatever it is, they're positioned elsewhere on those lines. So LCT is less like a kind of set of boxes and more like a sort of multi-dimensional positioning system that describes longitude and latitude and altitude and speed and trajectory and so on, where each of those measures is in relation to other possible settings. That's relational thinking. And that's embodied by planes and by profiles. And again, it's easy to forget how unusual those things are. I mean, LCT has analytics. It is very visual. Let's take specialization, for example. When you analyze something with specialization codes, you're also positioning it on the plane. So you analyze it in terms of its relative strengths of epistemic relations, which is position on the y-axis, and social relations or location on the x-axis, and then bringing those two together, place it not just in one of the core principal codes, but at a specific location within that code. So we see on the slide, A and B both exhibit relatively stronger epistemic relations and relatively weaker social relations than most other possible strengths. And those strengths are relative not just to each other, but to all other potentialities. In other words, everywhere else on that plane, all those blank spaces, every single one of those is another combination of strengths, another possible combination of strengths. Compare that to a set of boxes. You've got a set of boxes, typologies, type, maybe 4, 5, whatever it might be. Here we've got an infinite number of possible positions on a plane or a profile. And each continuum of strengths, the y-axis and the x-axis, also has infinite capacity for gradation. What does that mean? It means you can divide up each axis into as many different strengths as you need. And that gives the planes and profiles their depth, their kind of fractal quality. Once you say kind of roughly locate practices in a code, you can zoom in with finer grained distinctions and locate more precisely their location. So A and B are both knowledge codes, but they also can be distinguished from each other. Codes aren't homogeneous. And that's an enormous expansion in the space of possible things that we can see. We see so much more variety and difference. And also, even more, we don't have to shove something in a box. We don't have to choose any one code. We can analyze and allocate data to more than one position. I mean, for example, if a text includes claims A, B, and C, it's got a range of positions across the plane. We could say that text is dominated by knowledge codes, but it would not be limited to that code. It wouldn't be squeezed into a box into which it didn't really fit. So LCT is relational thinking. LCT helps you think outside the box. Now, that's not to say that LCT doesn't use boxes or make sharp distinctions. Translation devices turn organizing principles, turn the continuum into discrete categories for analyzing data. And each device, divides that continuum of strengths into a series of different strengths and then provides empirical indicators for identifying and allocating data to each of those categories. This one by Helen Giorgio did that for semantic gravity for her specific data. The categories may look like a typology, particularly if they're given names, but a translation device does not embody substantialist thinking. Basically, the key difference is that the categories are not trying to model what's being analyzed. They're not trying to say this is everything about it. They're just a bridge. They're a bridge between a set of data and relational concepts like semantic gravity. They show how the concept is enacted within that problem situation. So the translation device doesn't do the work of explanation. It translates between what is being explained and the concept that's going to explain it, which is relational. So my point really is here that the ways of thinking matter. It's not whether you make sharp distinctions or whether you use boxes or whatever. It's the way of thinking embodied by the concepts and the way you use them. And LCT embodies relational thinking, which radically expands what we can see by making the relations visible. Okay, the third way of thinking, which I think is much simpler actually, it concerns how we think about change. Now, since before Socrates, there's been a divide between either looking at what is constant and unchanging or focusing on what changes. And these are often called being and becoming. And the ordinary vision of the social world uses static thinking that focuses on being. So, for example, knowledge types are usually static, unchanging forms, pure is pure, applied is applied, so on. And that can make it hard to see processes of movement between different types, such as when a discussion moves between using everyday knowledge and academic knowledge. And it's hard to see transformation, where knowledge practices change types, such as how pure knowledge becomes applied knowledge. Static thinking treats both those kinds of changes as like all or nothing leaps between either or states. Something is either pure or applied and then jumps and is all or nothing jump to being another category, another type. So that limits the space of possible practices that we can see. We can't see anything in between the types or anything that happens through time. Now, again, you might not need to. It might not be useful for you. My point is that it should be a possibility in case you need it. And LCT offers that possibility. It sees not only static states, it also sees change. It sees both being and becoming. So if we want to look at being or static states, you can say, for example, do a constellation analysis and show the configuration of practices at a particular moment in time. You can analyze that with various legitimation codes and show the organizing principles underlying that at that moment in time. That would show a state. And that may be all we need to explain a problem. But we can also see change. To use LCT, one should be always thinking of everything as in motion, even if you take a snapshot. Everything is having a past and a future in which they potentially change from one form to another, and in which they have a trajectory that also might have your insights. So we always got to remember that legitimation code that we show is just for the period being analyzed, and consider whether we need to explore how those codes are changing, where it's come and where it's going to. And LCT offers that capacity. It does it in sort of, well, at least three ways. I'll do three. First, constellations, they're changeable and fluid, so we can explore how constellations are reconfigured over time to reveal how the sort of practices change when, for example, they're recontextualized from a curriculum into a classroom. So here's an example from teaching science from secondary classrooms and teaching science. The one on the left is from 5 textbooks. The one on the right is one way of teaching those ideas. And this is just to show that we can analyze how things change using constellations. We can actually see recontextualization. Instead of just saying it happens, we can actually show it. Second, by using planes and profiles, we can actually see change directly. We can actually analyze the change itself. We can see changes within codes, we can trace them and see changes between codes, and we can trace their trajectories over time on things like profiles and see things like semantic waves and pathways. We can do pathways and see things like autonomy tools. And we can also see not only just change, but also transformations between within practices. For example, how things change themselves, how any particular thing changes. A couple of examples from semantics is the notion of condensation. Condensation, change in semantic density, the complexity of meanings. So a word might change in terms of its semantic density or its complexity in terms of how many meanings are packed up into it. When, say, a teacher defines a technical concept, they're packing these in, it's changing, it's getting condensed. We can talk about condensation, a process of transformation in something, and then we can visualize those in planes and profiles. In that case, it's a movement right on the plane, or it's an upshift on the semantic profile. And we've got similar processes for all the movements on all the planes of LCT. So in other words, we can see change, we can make change visible. And that again, hugely expands the space of possibles. Instead of seeing a small number of unchanging states, which is what static thinking offers, we can see lots of trajectories. We can see transformations between and within practices. And they actually reveal patterns and other new things that otherwise would be concealed. For example, in arguments that use substantialist and static thinking, it's being argued about curriculum, that it would be more powerful to add more academic knowledge and have less everyday knowledge. So just add one, take away another. But if you see patterns, if you can see things through time, you can see what's more powerful, such as weaving those forms together in semantic waves, a pattern through time, or weaving them together through autonomy tools. So the dynamic thinking of LCT makes change visible and brings to light far more possibilities. Okay, so I've discussed three modes of thinking, three modes of thought embodied by LCT: realist, relational, dynamic. They all expand more. We can see more about the social world. The last way of thinking I'm going to discuss brings me back to big dichotomies. And it's to do with how ideas and concepts and methods are brought together. Now, I said earlier that with big dichotomies, if you choose one stance, you're constellated with a series of whole other stances. The small print is terrible. And one thing that doesn't help is when one focuses only on concepts and methods and discussing them, and downplay the importance of problem situations for deciding what concepts and methods to choose and bring together. I mean, I should say that this kind of approach-oriented thinking does reflect some important truths. It is easy to forget. It's important to not forget that theories matter, that there is no data without theory. It's just a chaotic flux. It's only white noise. But too often research focuses so much on theories and methods that it can downplay and forget the role of specific objects of study, specific research questions, specific forms of data in shaping what and how things are done. And that kind of problem, that kind of approach-oriented thinking is tend to be shown by what's not discussed. So, for example, knowledge types are usually treated and defined as if they're universally applicable without any kind of adaptation. They're usually defined as always and everywhere the same. And there's little discussion of the role of a particular problem in shaping which concepts to use and how to put them together. If that kind of thinking is all there is, then it can lead to the strategies that support big dichotomies. Research studies either use the typology or they don't, either or. And if they do, it's usually as a whole, or all or nothing. And that's what leads us to the sort of thing I talked about just a minute ago, a for or against. For academic knowledge, against everyday knowledge. And another thing is that opportunities for problems to speak back to the theory can be stifled. For example, practices that don't fit into a typology are not easily recognized. Now, LCT shares with that, oh, sorry for that, you missed all of that stuff. Now, LCT shares with that kind of thinking the idea that theories construct their objects of study, but it also emphasizes the role of problems. Problem-oriented thinking. First, which concepts to choose from LCT is not set in advance. It depends on what might help solve your problem. All organizing principles underlie all social practices, but not all principles need to be analyzed. You don't need to use all the concepts. You only need as much theory as the problem requires. So there's a lot more possibilities. You could use semantic gravity. You could use semantic gravity and semantic density. You could use others in various combinations. And that all organizing principles underlie all practices also means that concepts are not limited to specific topics or questions. There's a lot more flexibility in what you can use to study what. So, for example, autonomy codes were introduced in a paper that studied the integration of different kinds of knowledge practices in secondary school discourse, so secondary school classroom discourse. But that topic isn't locked to that. That topic can be explored with concepts from semantics or specialization. And conversely, autonomy can be used to analyze all kinds of other things. So if existing studies in LCT use particular concepts to explore particular issues, that can be suggestive, but it's not limiting. That someone's used semantic gravity to analyze, say, biology textbooks doesn't mean you have to use that concept if you're researching biology or textbooks. The driving question is whether analyzing and organizing principle helps explain and suggest solutions for the problem at hand. And you might need to try a number of concepts before you settle on the combination that gives the most insight. And it's the same for analytic methods, for the analytics. That's not set in advance. Profiles, pathways, constellations, none of those are limited to a specific dimension. I introduced the analytic of tracking pathways with autonomy codes, but you can track pathways in semantics and in specialization. You can see semantic tools, you can see specialization tools. And that's also true of profiles. I introduced that idea alongside semantics, but you can actually trace profiles with specialization or with autonomy. You can see autonomy waves. And constellations can be used on their own or with concepts from any dimension. So the analytics can be combined with anything. And that's also true about the methods. You can use qualitative, you can use quantitative, you can use it for all kinds of data. You can use it at any level, from a single word to an entire education system. So that problem-oriented thinking opens up the space of possible concepts, analytics, methodologies, methods, forms of data, scale of analysis. So many combinations can be put together, and each choice is separate. So unlike big dichotomies, one choice does not necessarily decide a series of other choices. This is sort of radical flexibility, places pressure on you to make explicit your reasons for each of your choices. Pointing to precedent is not enough. The question is how each choice real-world data. It's all about attending closely to the possibilities offered by each problem to enable the new and the unexpected to emerge. So emphasizing that dialogue between approaches and problems means that LCT again opens up more space for new possibilities. Okay, so to conclude, I've discussed how big dichotomies work by giving the impression that we face either or choices that mean we must show allegiance to whole constellations of stances, and I argued they limit what we can do and see, making it harder to understand and change the social world. And I've argued that LCT is an approach that embodies and supports a mindset of possibility. And I outlined 4 ways of thinking that LCT involves, and which I think you need to grasp if you want to realize its full potential. And finally, I argued that each of these modes of thought expand what we can see and what we can do in our research. And I compared concepts to knowledge typologies, but that was just to give an example. And my point isn't to focus on that, and it's not to dismiss other kinds of frameworks, but it's rather just to show that different concepts have different affordances, different capacities, including the ways of thinking that they can enable and sustain. All of this means that we do have a real choice. We can choose to see more if we want to. We can see more than what is readily or ostensibly visible. We can see how relations make things what they are. We can see how everything is in motion. And we can make problems the key to what we bring together in our work. So welcome to this conference and welcome to LCT. This is the world where anything is possible. And where you go from here is a choice I leave to you. Thank you. Oh, the deafening silence at the end of the Zoom. Hi, how are we doing this, Lee? Are we just, anybody ask any question, jump in, or how you want to do it? We've only got a few minutes, but we do have a few minutes.
Yeah, there was a question in the chat, but I think that, you know, what's the point of categorizing practice or student behavior? But I think that you then chatted about the transformation and the changes that become possible and able to see what's happening. And I think Helen also contributed an answer. Helen, do you want to step in?
Well, does somebody have a question rather than stuff that's been answered? Okay. Or a comment, or, you know, anything at all? Remember, everybody, by the way, that doing a Zoom talk, which is why everything else is going to be interactive after this, doing a Zoom talk is like staring into the face of a Dementor from Harry Potter, or life leaves you.
Carl, maybe you can look at the question in the chat, and Helen did
there's
answer
far
it.
too much in there to see. Do you want to tell me?
Oh, I see. Okay. No, then don't worry. I think there's a lot of questions that are now coming through. So maybe whoever's the invigilator can start posing those questions to you.
Sure. Well, anyone can just jump in. Anybody can just jump in and ask me.
It looks like Shoba's got a question. Shoba?
Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Carl. I'm actually always, I just learn so much every time I hear a presentation. And although it sounds introductory, there's always so much of power in it. It's actually a comment because I battled a lot you know, with the notions of the negative and the positive note symbols. And you made it very clear, I mean, the light went on some time ago for me, but you made it very clear again today, where you spoke about it's not the fact that something does not exist, but it's at the level, you know, the varying strengths, either with the social and the epistemic. And it took me, it was quite a stumbling block for me to get my head around understanding that they both actually exist. It's the strengths of it. So thank you for that, making that explicit again. It really helps. Thank you.
Cool. And I apologize to everybody for not having enough time right now to have much of a discussion of this. It's simply because the timing of everything meant that we had to kind of squeeze this into the first session. So we're going to be doing a whole 4 hours on this on Wednesday in the LCT New South Wales NSW sessions. I think they're 36 and 38. We're going to do a whole 4 hours on big dichotomies and the ways of thinking. So join us there, and we'll be actually working with these ideas a lot more. So you'll have a chance to sort of allow them to percolate through and marinate in your head, and then actually get your hands dirty with some ideas.